Hello everyone! Win your pawn endgames. I've prepared 17 exercises for you so you won't miss a thing. We're going to start with this first exercise. An exercise that might seem simple, king and pawn versus king. But as you know, the only way to win is for the pawn to make it all the way to the end of the board. But the black king is there to block it. So what should you do? It might seem tempting to push the pawn to d4. That's often the move that beginner players will make. And yet it's a mistake. The only way to win here is to put the king in front of the pawn. It might seem counterproductive to get in front of your own pawn, but it's the only way to win, and I'm going to prove it to you. Let's first look at what happens if we push the pawn. How do black manage to draw? The king would simply move back. And as soon as the white king tries to get through, the black king will oppose him. This is what we call the opposition of the kings. It's when one king stands directly in front of the other, and that prevents the white king from getting through. The only way to try to make progress is to check with the pawn. And white feels like they're gaining ground. Actually, it's not just a feeling. They are gaining ground, but it will be fruitless. It will end in a blockade. Now, if the white king comes to c5, the black king comes to c7 and opposes him. And if the white king comes to e5, the black king comes to e7 and opposes him. Always in defense, oppose the attacking king. On check, you block the pawn. You move straight back to always be ready to oppose the infiltration of the white king. For example, if the king goes to e6, you play king to e8. Check, king to d8, and now either the white king moves away from the pawn and the black king will capture it, or the white king comes to d6 and we have this complete blockade situation that leads to a draw. So in this position we've just understood that pushing the pawn whether to d3 or d4 won't work. You have to put your king in front of the pawn. And here it's white who takes the opposition. It's white who places their king directly in front of the opponent's king. And now the opponent's king has to give ground. Either he moves back and we advance, it's easy, or the black king goes to one side and we enter from the other. If the king comes to c4, we can advance the pawn to d4 without any problem. If the king comes to c6, don't advance the pawn to d4, because in that case the black king will get back in front of the pawn and will end up in a blocked position. If possible, always gain ground with your king, king to a5. If the black king moves down, this time we can play d4 check, because the black king won't be able to get back in front of the pawn. If the black king comes to d7, we go back to d5. We retake the opposition always to worsen the black king's position. Then we infiltrate. If the black king comes to e6, now we advance the pawn to d4. And if you look closely, we control the squares up to the 7th rank. King to e7, pawn to d5, king to d8. And now what do? Do you advance your pawn or do you put the king in front of your pawn? What do you think? If you listen to the lesson, you should put the king in front of the pawn. If you advance your pawn, it will end in a draw. King to c8, d7, king to d8, king to d6. And we have this situation of complete blockage. So you have to put the king back in front of the pawn. And as soon as the black king moves away, you infiltrate from the other side, and the last 3 squares guarantee the promotion of the pawn to a queen. Well, after that, you need to know how to win with the queen, but that's actually easy. You just have to attack the king, protected, of course, by your own king. And as soon as the king moves away, you trap him in a prison. And as soon as the black king touches a square on the edge, you're going to trap him, but not too close. Because if you play queen to b6, you trap him so much that you create a stalemate situation. On the other hand, you can go to b5, after which the king only has the a7 square. The idea now is to put the queen in front to deliver checkmate, but here the king would capture the queen. So you need to take the time to bring your king closer, who will support the arrival of the queen. As soon as the king is nearby, there are also other checkmates, for example, queen to a5 here, or even queen to a4. We saw in the previous situation that the right way to play with king and pawn is to put the king in front of the pawn. But when it comes to a pawn on the A or H file, you can't win even if you play correctly. For example, if I play king to h3, which would allow me to win if my pawn were on any other file, but here it won't work. Quite simply because if the black king moves over here to g5, you can't get around to the other side. So you're forced to get back in front, and the black king returns. And when you push the pawn, you know it will simply end in a draw. Because from the start, you weren't able to outflank with the king. And as you can see, it will end in a completely blocked position. Third position, the information we just learned that a pawn on the A or H file can't win will be combined with another piece of information. If you have a bishop that is not the same color as the promotion square of the pawn, you also can't win. That's something you need to know. It can be useful in certain endgames. I'll show you an example later, a practical example. But you see, in this position, if we had a dark squared bishop, we would win. But since the light squared bishop doesn't control the promotion square on h8, it will end in a stalemate no matter what. For example, I can check the king, he'll move back, and the black king just has to get stuck on h8. The pawn can advance, but the black king doesn't even need to do anything to try to fight against the pawn's advance. He will always try to keep the h8 square. For example, we can give check, the king moves there, we can bring our king closer, but that will cause a complete blockade and it will be a draw. And if we free up the square again, the king moves there, we can attack, the king goes to h8, and as soon as we bring our king closer, it once again leads to a complete blockade. Here is now a practical situation that could occur in an endgame during a game. If it's black to move, what should they play in your opinion? You can pause the video to take your time and think about it. Do you have an idea? What is actually dangerous for black is the g2 pawn. Not the h3 pawn and not the light squared bishop, because the light squared bishop does not control the black promotion square of the pawn. And so the right move for black is to play bishop takes h3. Because if white recaptures, they have a rook's pawn and a bishop that is not of the promotion square's color of the promotion square. So it's a draw. The black king just needs to head straight for that square. If white doesn't recapture, what will they do? After all, the pawn can't advance, otherwise the bishop would be lost. And besides, the bishop can always capture the pawn if it stays there, and that will lead to a draw, because a position with just a king and a bishop can't win. I started with a position where the kings were fairly close to each other, and I showed you the technique of close opposition. But now I'm going to talk to you about distant opposition, which can be achieved and which could then allow us to have close opposition. Let me explain. In this position, it's black to move. If they could, black would play king to a5. But of course they can't. But king to a5 would allow them to have close opposition and block the white king. And if the pawn advances, the black king will calmly head toward the pawn and it will be a draw. But since the black king can't go to a5, you might think he'll go to a6. Except that on e6, that's going to lose. In reality, you have to go to e7. Why? If you go to e6, a white square, the king can take close opposition on a white square. Take note, this detail about the color will help you. Opposition is always, when you're on a file or a rank, always on the same color square. If your opponent is on a black square, you need to be on a black square. If they're on a white square, you need to be on a white square. And that's how you get the opposition. And in this diagram, it's white who gets the opposition. And they've just moved on to the same color square as the black king. That means the black king can go to d6, but then we go to d4. He can go to c6, but then we go to c4. He can go to b6, but then we go to b4. And as soon as the black king steps aside, the white king enters and will win, just like in the first position I showed you. So that means if black goes to e6, white can play king to e4 and get the close opposition. Black, so they have to go to e7. And it's them who take the distant opposition, because the white king on the e-file is on a dark square. If the black king could go to e5, which is a dark square, he would have the close opposition, but he can't. So he has to take the distant opposition by going to e7. King to e7 will secure the draw. If the pawn advances, the king will be able to get closer to the pawn. If the white king comes to e4, we go to e6, close opposition. If the white king comes to d4, we go to d6, close opposition. And it will end in a draw. Look, king to d4, king to d6, king to c4, king to c6, king to b4, king to b6. And you see we continuously block the king. And so we leave white no other option to make progress except to push the pawn. But as soon as the pawn advances, we know it will end in a blocked position. I'll show it to you once again. The king retreats straight back. And as soon as the white king comes in, we block. And we have this final blocked position. Now you know that close opposition would allow you to draw, but here it's not possible for the king to reach e5. So you have to play for distant opposition. Sometimes that's an option that could help you save yourself in endgames. Unfortunately, opposition doesn't always work. There's a factor that can interfere with this opposition strategy, and that's the waiting move. Look, here the black king can't take the close opposition, so he'll take the distant opposition as I mentioned. If the king comes to d4, the black king takes the close opposition. King to c4, king to c6. king to b4, king to b6. And so the black king did exactly what I told you. He always took the opposition. But in this position, there was no way to save the game anyway. White was going to win no matter what because white has this little waiting move. In the previous diagram, the pawn was on b3, but here it is on b2. And so white can simply push the pawn, they reverse the opposition, and the black king has to give ground. Even if you have the chance to take the opposition, if your opponent has waiting moves, especially small pawn moves, in the end, they will make you lose the opposition anyway. Now, we're going to work on the rule of the square. How can you tell at a glance if a king can catch up to a pawn? Instead of starting to calculate, there's a visual trick. For example, if the pawn advances to a4, we know right away that the king can catch up to this pawn. You just need to draw a square using the pawn square and the promotion square as corners, and you have your square. If the king whose turn it is can enter the square, then he will be able to stop the pawn. And here that's the case. It's black's king, it's his move, so he can enter the square. If the pawn advances, the square becomes smaller, but the black king is still able to enter the square. And nothing will prevent the black king here from getting into the square and capturing the pawn. This means that in this starting position, white cannot win, because if they push the pawn, the black king gets into the square. And if the king moves aside, the black king will always have the opposition by blocking the white king and gradually approaching the pawn. Earlier, I told you that opposition doesn't always work because of the waiting move. Well, for the rule of the square, it's the same. It doesn't always work, not because of a waiting move, but because of the obstruction sacrifice. You sacrifice a piece or a pawn to block access, and that's what I'm going to show you. When the pawn advances to a 4, if we draw the square, we see that the black king is perfectly able to enter the square. And so if we push the pawn again, the black king enters the square and will eventually stop this pawn. But at the start, white can play the obstruction sacrifice. They can push their pawn to d5. Black is forced to capture it, otherwise this pawn will keep going and promote to a queen. And as soon as the pawn is taken, the other passed pawn advances. We see that the black king is able to enter the square, but we keep pushing forward. And now the black king is no longer able to enter the square because of his own pawn, which acts as an obstruction, blocking the king's path. And if the king tries to go around, he will lose time, and we see that now he is no longer able to enter the square. So he will no longer be able to stop the pawn from promoting to a queen. So in the previous examples, we saw confrontations between a king and a passed pawn. But what happens when there are no passed pawns yet? You know, a passed pawn is a pawn that isn't stopped by other pawns. Here, in this position, white doesn't have any passed pawns. They have what's called a majority, meaning they have 2 pawns against 1. And in a majority, there are what we call candidate pawns. Candidate pawns are pawns that don't have any opposing pawns directly in front of them. So the pawn on c4 is a candidate pawn because black doesn't have a pawn on the c file, so it will soon become a passed pawn. When we push the pawn to c5, black can capture, we recapture, and then we'll have a passed pawn. So how do you play king endgames with majorities? Well, don't push your pawns forward right away to try to create a passed pawn unless you've calculated that it will win for you. But most of the time, it's better to improve your king's position before creating the passed pawn. In fact, if you create the passed pawn immediately, the black king will come to block it, you bring your white king over, and you know that this position is a draw. We worked on this in the first diagram. The king retreats straight back, and as soon as the white king tries to outflank, the black king counters it. So don't push your pawn forward too primitively. Try to improve your king's position first. King to d4, that's the right move. Black can play king to c6. And here, don't play c5 because there will be a capture, recapture, and we'll end up in a blocked position. Don't play b5 check either, because the black king will take the opposition to block the white king and doubly control the c5 square to prevent the white pawn from advancing. So the right way to proceed is to keep trying to outflank with your king. If black plays b5, you counter-push with c5. And if the black king moves back, you move in. For example, if the black king goes to c7, you can enter on e6. If he goes to c6 to take lateral opposition on the rank, you can go to e7. He'll go to c7 to prevent your king from penetrating, but now you can play b5 to take away the c6 square and force him to move. He moves back, you move in. He moves back again, you move in. He moves back once more and you capture the pawn. Let's review the sequence because I still have something else to show you. On king d4, king c6, we said that pushing the pawn immediately leads to a draw, so it's better to play king e5. If he plays b5, I mentioned the move c5, we counter push the pawn. King c7, king d5, and now you might say, but the black king can take the opposition. And if we advance to give check, the black king blocks. And if we come to c5, the black king can retreat. And it's true that if these two pawns weren't here, it would be a draw. But since these two pawns are here, as soon as the black king retreats, we'll take the b5 pawn. And then we'll move the king aside so the second pawn can advance. And one pawn wouldn't be enough to win, but with two pawns, you'll be able to drive the king away and promote to a queen. So what happens when one player has a passed pawn and the other player has a majority? That's the case in this position. White has the passed pawn on the g-file, and black has a majority of 3 pawns against 2, with the c6 pawn, which is a candidate pawn because there is no black pawn in front of it. So black's goal is to try to push this candidate pawn up to c4 to create a passed pawn. But in this position, white is going to win. Why are they going to win? Because they have the distant passed pawn, and that's an advantage in endgames. The one who has distant passed pawns often has the advantage because it will distract the black king from the rest of the fight. You see, the black king will have to deal with the passed g-pawn. The blocked one might be eliminated. But meanwhile, the white king will be able to eliminate the rest of the pawns because the problem for the black king when he is on the g-file is that there will be nothing left for him to do. So we play g4, and now the black king is forced to take care of this pawn, because in just 4 moves it will promote to a queen. For example, king to e5, then white should play b4 to try to fix black's majority. For example, pawn takes, and if the black king comes to f4 to attack the pawn, we simply go to d4 to go after those 2 pawns. And the black king doesn't have time to come back. He can try, but you know that for the black king to get a draw, he would have to reach b7 to have the close opposition. And here, he isn't able to get it. So white wins. We've seen that passed pawns are an advantage in endgames. And when you have 2 distant passed pawns, that's the ultimate weapon. You win practically every king endgame. For example, in this position, black has 2 connected passed pawns, meaning they protect each other, they're side by side. But the white king is able for a certain time to hold them in place. Whereas the black king is completely unable to stop 2 pawns that are far apart, because he can't be in 2 places at once. The king is a short-range piece. We've seen that the goal in king endgames is, of course, to get passed pawns. Either you already have them, or you try to create them thanks to a pawn majority. For example, 3 pawns against 2, or 2 pawns against 1. But what happens when you don't have any passed pawns and no pawn majority? Well, in rare cases, you can still create a passed pawn. You see, in this position, there are 3 pawns against 3. It's white's move, and white can create a passed pawn. But 2 conditions must be met first. First, you need to have a space advantage, which is the case in this position. And second, the black king must be far away, which is also the case here. So, to create a passed pawn, we will have to sacrifice pawns. And even here, we will have to sacrifice 2 pawns to try to get a passed pawn. That means if we sacrifice pawns, the opponent will also get passed pawns. That's why it's important to have a space advantage. Because the opponent will have passed pawns, but they will be very far from queening. Whereas if we're very close to the promotion square, even with just 1 passed pawn, we'll make it. So how do we do it? We need to use the double lever. We have to play bishop 6 to prevent the position from becoming locked. For example, if we play a 6, black can capture. And if we recapture, it gets blocked. And actually, the black king is even closer than the white king. He could immediately come to f6 and try to win the c-pawn to get a passed pawn. So the right move here is b6, because here black can't block the situation. If one pawn advances, we'll take the other. So black will have to capture. And when black captures, they'll create a candidate pawn for white. For example, if black captures with the a7 pawn, it's the a5 pawn that becomes a candidate pawn because there's no pawn in front of it. But what is blocking that pawn's advance? It's the b7 pawn. So we're going to do what's called a deflection sacrifice. We play c6 to deflect the b7 pawn. The b7 pawn is forced to capture, otherwise it will itself fall victim to the c6 pawn. And after the capture, the path is clear. And as you can see, black has 3 passed pawns, but they're too far from the promotion square. And since the black king is also out of the way, that allows the pawn to reach the end and promote to a queen. If after bishop 6 black captures with the c7 pawn, then the c5 pawn becomes the candidate pawn. So this time we play a 6 to deflect the b7 pawn, then play c6, and we'll get a queen. Look at this diagram. Well, there's no pawn majority. It's 4 pawns against 4. But we have a space advantage and the black king is far away. So we'll be able to try to create a passed pawn and win. How are we going to do that? We'll start with f5. Actually, we could also start with g5. It's symmetrical. But let's look at what happens after f5. We already know that black can't capture, because if black takes, we recapture. And white keeps a candidate pawn. They'll play a6 and have their passed pawn. For example, king to c4, e6, pawn takes, and you can clearly see that the black king can't get into the square, so the pawn will promote to a queen. So after pushing f5, black will try to bring their king closer, and here we don't take on a 6 because black would stabilize things, but instead we play g5. And you'll notice that black can't take either the f5 pawn or the g5 pawn, because that would give white a candidate pawn, and white would be able to create a passed pawn. For example, if black takes on f5, then the e5 pawn becomes the new candidate. f7 blocks it. So we play g6 to unblock, to deflect the pawn, and then we advance e6. And if black takes on g5, then the h5 pawn becomes the candidate, so we play f6. And after the capture a6, and in 2 moves we promote to a queen. So after playing f5 and after playing g5, the king will get even closer. And now we play f6. If black does nothing, we'll take the g7 pawn, so they really have to react. And if they take on f6, we take on h6, and it's always the same. The pawn will promote to a queen. And if black plays g6, we have plenty of ways to win. We can take on h6, we can even take on g6, and after the recapture, play, for example, f7, or take on h6. There are plenty of ways here to get your passed pawn to promote to a queen. Now let's look at connected passed pawns versus isolated pawns. What are connected passed pawns? We've talked about it a little. There are 2 pawns side by side that protect each other. That means the white king can block them, but he can't capture them. We'll see that for isolated pawns, it's the same thing. The black king could block them, but won't be able to capture them, even though the pawns don't protect each other. Let's try to understand why. The white king comes to b3, and the black king is going to attack one of the isolated pawns. So the white side will push the other pawn forward. And here, the black king can't take, otherwise he won't be in the square anymore, and the pawn will promote to a queen. So what will black do? Well, they'll play king to f6. White won't push the f5 pawn, otherwise it will get captured. For example, if f5 black takes, and after h6 the black king enters the square and will be able to eliminate the pawn. And white also shouldn't play h6 because the black king can come to g6 and eliminate the pawn. So the best move for white is to go back to a 2. And not to take the b4 pawn, otherwise the a3 pawn will advance and promote to a queen. So the king goes to a 2. The black king could return to f5, and that would be a draw. King to f5, if the pawn advances, the king comes back to g6 and stops this pawn. So for example, king to b3 and we return to f6. And you see it's a draw. Both kings will approach the pawns but will never be able to capture them. Now the player with the black pieces can still make a mistake. For example, let's imagine they go to g7. We advance the pawn. The black king can attack a pawn again. The other passed pawn advances and the black king can't catch it, so he goes to f7. The white king comes to b3, and now the black king absolutely must return to f6 and not go to g8. Earlier, that allowed for a draw, but not when the pawns reach the 6th rank. The black king absolutely must come to f6. If the pawn advances, we'll stop it. And if the white king comes to a 2, we go back to f7. So the white king has to use the a2 and b3 squares, and the black king the f7 and f6 squares. But if the black king goes to g8, that's going to lose. Pawn to f6, and now as soon as the black king approaches one of the electric pawns, the other advances and the black king can no longer retreat and can't prevent the pawn from promoting. If the black king comes to f7, h7, and it's the same. If the king comes to f8, there will be h7 anyway, and you see that's the blockade. White is going to get a queen. What happens when the pawns are separated by 2 squares? That's interesting. So black still has connected passed pawns. We know that the white king will be able to block them, but not catch the pawns. He'll play king to b3, king to a2. He'll oscillate between these 2 squares. But the black king, on the other hand, will be able to win the pawns. When the pawns are side by side, connected passed pawns, they can be blocked. When the pawns are separated by 1 square, like the electric pawns we saw earlier, they can be blocked. When they're separated by 2 squares, the pawns can not only be blocked, but even eliminated. For example, if the king comes to b3, the black king will come to attack the pawn on h4. If the white king moves back to a2, the pawn can be taken, and if the pawn advances, the black king is in the square and will capture the other pawn. So white might play e5, and here the black king must not take the pawn on h4, otherwise he won't be in the square. So the black king has to go to g6. Pushing the pawn to h5 gives the pawn to black, and then they're in the square. So what will white do? They won't play to e6 either, because king to f6 and the black king will be in the square. White will wait. But now the black king will come to f5 to attack the pawn. And even if h5 is played, he takes it. And even if h6 is played, look at the square. The king enters the square. And the king can stop and eliminate all these pawns. But there is still a danger. That of completely blocking the king. For example, if the king comes to b3, the black king will of course come closer to help the two pawns, but you mustn't play too quickly. Look, this is winning for black, but you mustn't play too quickly. King f6, king b3, king e5, king a2. Why? Because the king is close to the corner and so he doesn't have many squares. If you block him completely, it would create a stalemate situation, resulting in a draw. King d4, king b3, for example, king d3, king a2, king c2, king i1. If you push the pawn to b3, that's a complete blockade. It's a draw. So you shouldn't play that. For example, let's play king b3, king b1, i2 check, king i1. And here, if you play king a3, that's a complete blockade and it's a draw again. You see, there are dangers. Here, you have to play king c2. Often you have to accept losing one of the pawns to ensure the other advances. And the white king can do absolutely nothing to stop the arrival of the queen. And it will end with checkmate. So what happens when the pawns are separated by 3 squares? We know that when the pawns are side by side, you can block them but not eliminate them. When they're separated by 1 square, the so-called electric pawns, you can block them but not eliminate them. When they're separated by 2 squares, not only can you block them, but you can also eliminate them. But when they're separated by 3 squares like this, you can't block them. White is guaranteed to win. Look, for example, I advance the pawn to d5. If the king comes to h5, the pawn advances and the black king won't be in the square. So maybe he'll come to f6. We advance the other one. The king can come to attack the pawn, but we advance to h6. And if the king takes the pawn, the h6 pawn will queen. And if the king plays f6, pawn to d6, he's completely overwhelmed, it's lost. I hope this video has given you enough concepts, some basic ideas to help you play your king endgames better. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and leave comments. Share the video as well, it really helps my channel get noticed. You can also support me as well. And we'll meet again soon for new learning videos. Goodbye everyone.